is one of the most controversial genres out there, and for good reason. It's unsettling, disturbing, and occasionally gross. If the content isn't dealing with psychological trauma or murder, then there are monsters, jump scares, or too many bodily fluids. Horror is disgusting and visceral. It should be reviled, but it is those elements which speak to people. And in today's video, I want to speculate as to why. I haven't personally read as many horror books as I'd like, and admittedly, I haven't watched many typical horror films in the vein of Halloween or the Blair Witch Project, but I've read the best of Stephen King's books and a great many Gothics from the 1800s. I've been entranced by the words of Poe and fascinated by the mythology of Lovecraft. Whenever I've dipped into the genre, I've been enthralled. For most, you either love or hate the genre. When it comes to the reviews horror novels receive, many hover under 4 stars, either because people find them gratuitous, not scary enough, or ironically enough, too scary or disturbing. In the latter case, the books are poorly reviewed for perfectly doing exactly what they set out to do. Here then are the 4 ways in which horror impacts us, and why the genre, despite its reputation, can be good for us. For me, the biggest reason horror continues to endure is because of the way it holds a mirror up to us. Many horror novels or films offer a deeper commentary on current events. They force us to examine ourselves, or they highlight our fears. Jordan Peele's films, for example, examine the appropriation Black people face of their culture, their bodies, and their lives, with Get Out telling a story of exploitation that is a creepy spin on the classic Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. In the 1900s, Black and white films like Godzilla or Them highlighted our fears of nuclear war, and the original King Kong forced us to reckon with our exploitation of the natural world or even of those we deem to be the other. A zombie story can offer a commentary on mindless consumerism, a vampire novel an exploration of toxic masculinity, or a creepy fairy tale retelling a feminist spin. While on the surface horror appears schlocky and gratuitous, it often explores deeper themes relevant to our own lives. Horror is painfully revealing, making it all the more uncomfortable or creepy, though not in the way people expect. Stephen King's novels don't portray an idealized America. King's America isn't all bad either, but he doesn't shy from his country's rough edges or sordid history, and an idyllic small town becomes a place of terror, not only because of an external monster, but because of the human tragedies which would occur with or without the fiend. Peppered throughout King's stories are instances of spousal abuse, child neglect, gang activity, and severe childhood bullying. The passages in Stephen King's novels which disturb me the most aren't those concerning his literal monsters, but his human monsters. Because with or without Pennywise, these monsters would exist. They do exist in our world. Reading it, I was unsettled not by the killer clown, but the budding serial killer Patrick Hocksetter, who at a tender age was already torturing animals and attempting to murder his baby brother. I've never felt ickier reading a book than when I had to spend time in Patrick's head, because King was giving me firsthand access to the mind of a psychopath. King shows the beauty of our world too, venerating such things as childhood and friendship, but he reveals the ugly crust that lies beneath the mundane. In true horror fashion, he forces us to confront our ugly, very human selves, our troubled society, and the damaged people created within it. Ironically, horror also offers escapism. For many, slashers or gory books can be cathartic. While we have to endure a string of grisly murders, we often, especially in your standard slasher, see good ultimately triumph over evil. Not all horrors have happy endings, but when they do, those can be more powerful than the ones delivered by a fantasy or a comedy, because we've had to watch our heroes go through hell. The victory over the monster feels earned after what the protagonist endured. If nothing else, horror, especially that which is rooted in fantasy or the paranormal, feels very removed from our lives. It feels very familiar too, with the best horror stories taking place in the most mundane of settings, but we still feel safe watching a slasher or reading a gothic because in the back of our minds, we know ghosts aren't real. While the horrific is playing out before us, we're still nestled on our couches, a hot chocolate in hand, a blanket spread over our laps, and our cat nestled close. Candles are lit, and maybe we're crocheting. Deep down, we know we're safe. We can give ourselves an adrenaline rush, but do so without endangering ourselves. Like getting a tattoo or riding a roller coaster, horror gives us a safe thrill. That's not to say horror can't give you nightmares or exacerbate your anxiety if you're already prone to it, but while not for everyone, horror offers a release for many. It allows us to explore our fears and anxieties while remaining snuggled on the couch. We can process our phobias of snakes, bugs, or insanity in the knowledge that we can A, shut the film off or close the book anytime, and B, enjoy something cozy afterwards if we need a breather. For whatever reason, many humans like being scared. Maybe this is a holdover from our ancestors, when seeing the shape of a predator in the shadows kept us alive. But whatever the reason, engaging with horror almost provides relief, engaging us in a primitive reaction which is otherwise neglected in real life. Horror can even make us feel empowered, because we see the heroes triumph against the odds, and as participants in their journey, feel like we survived too. I know for me that there's a measure of fun in imagining what I would do in a given scenario. Realistically, I'd probably be one of the early deaths, but armed with the knowledge of the onlooker, I still love to picture how I'd survive something like The Happening or Jaws. If I'm reading about a serial killer, I'll look around the living room and picture what I'd grab first as a weapon. For anyone curious, my mind usually goes first to the lamp, because it seems like a good blunt weapon. When it comes to vampires, I imagine the ways in which I'd persuade such a figure to change me too. In vampire horror especially, there's no shortage of escapism. I'm very aware of the distinction between fantasy and reality, but I nevertheless daydream about what I'd do if I became a vampire. I think about the people I'd like to suck dry, that the world might be a better place. I considered what I'd do, what I'd read and learn and make with all that free time. And I ponder ways I might continue appearing in public, be it online or among friends, without my lack of aging becoming evident. Horror offers escapism on so many levels. It offers pure fantasy, being on occasion a creepier version of the genre. It makes us feel like survivors when we remain at the end alongside the few survivors, and it gives us a thrill, satisfying a primordial urge without placing us in actual danger. If nothing else, Most horror stories also make our own lives look a lot better in comparison. After all, crappy as your retail job might be, at least your kids aren't being stalked by killer clowns, right? Well, unless you're still living in the late 2010s, since that was apparently a whole thing. I'd argue among all genres that horror is also one of the oldest. Horror even became popular before fantasy, with Lovecraft and Poe serving as the mainstream sources of entertainment before we saw the likes of fantasy. Horror overlaps with another genre too, the Gothic, which was immensely popular in the 1800s. That blend of horror gave us Dracula, Frankenstein, Carmilla, and the picture of Dorian Gray. In the Gothic arena, we had such hints as the Monk and the Count of Udolpho. Before even that, though, horror is a part of our traditions, folklore, and mythology. While much of mythology could ostensibly be labeled as fantasy, many of our myths are disturbing in nature. Looking at folklore from around the world, we have figures like La Llorona, and equally as ancient, such beings as the vampire, the werewolf, the succubus, and the ghost. Ghost stories, especially, have always been popular to tell around the fire, be it while camping or gathered within the cozy confines of your living room. A Christmas Carol, despite being a Christmas novel, sometimes feels more like a Halloween story, what with its moody atmosphere and visiting spirits. The Ghosts of Christmas Future, in particular, calls to mind the Grim Reaper, forcing us to consider our own mortality. Then there's the Krampus tradition, which likewise makes Christmas creepier than not. People told tales of witches throughout medieval times, and the passages depicted in the Bible of hell would fit right into any horror novel. Surrounded as we are by cushy homes and medical technology, it's easy for us to forget that even 100 years ago, life was rough. The proliferation of horror stories during earlier times served as a coping mechanism because people were often surrounded by disease, famine, and death. Back in the 1800s, you really could catch your death. Once, one of the most famous Gothic writers, Charlotte Bronte, caught a fatal illness, ironically enough, at her brother's funeral. And it's not a secret that the sisters and their brother, Branwell, died within quick succession of each other, despite their relatively upper-class living conditions and youth. Even more than we do now, people had to grapple with the harsh reality of death. In Dickens' time, you couldn't take your days for granted, which is why Scrooge is given such a harsh reality check. His great wealth couldn't protect him from a sudden bout of pneumonia, so everyone, the rich or the poor, had to seriously consider how they lived their lives. And ghost stories became popular because they offered either a lesson in how to live better or a potential connection to deceased loved ones, especially those taken too soon. Seances became popular in the 1800s, and even the ostensibly sensible Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes and a horror story of his own, The Hound of the Baskervilles, was a great believer in ghosts. You almost had to be in order to cope with the fact that you could be dead next month. Horror was so popular back then because so many were trapped in a living horror, and the bleakness of many Bronte or Dickens novels captured the sense of futility many at the time felt in real life. Life was hard, and our oldest novels and legends echoed that. Our superstitions were meant to keep us safe. Tales of Little Red Riding Hood and werewolves kept us out of the forest during a time when being eaten by an actual wolf was a true threat. They taught us lessons, kept us alive, or made us feel safe. Such legends even gave us a sense of control. If you behaved, Krampus wouldn't come for you, or in other cultures, the Yule Cat. If we lived our lives well, we wouldn't die with regrets like Jacob Marley. And if we stayed close to home, we wouldn't doom ourselves and our families to the ravages of the big bad wolf. Horror also speaks especially to those who are marginalized, because so much of human fear is rooted in the fear of the other. We fear that which we don't understand, on the basis that it could be dangerous. Sadly, the worst forms of bigotry are rooted in fear, that your children will be attacked, your jobs taken away, or your culture erased. Mostly, such fears are unfounded, but humans are still animals, and so these fears, however irrational, persist. Horror stories can and have been used to demonize minorities further. Despite a continued appreciation of Lovecraft, the public hasn't failed to acknowledge his racism, pointing out how some of his creepy legends serve as twisted metaphors for Black people. Moreover, the vampire novels of the 1800s highlight the fear people had of sexuality, especially when it comes from women or those who are gender nonconforming. It's not an accident that the heroes within Dracula are first preyed upon by women, Dracula's condemned wives, who were a perversion at the time of the chaste feminine ideal. Carmilla could be seen as a commentary on the wrongness of feminine power, worsened by the idea that a woman could dominate another woman. Though such stories have been reclaimed, and we've made a conscious effort to perceive them in a more flattering light, it's unlikely Carmilla was written to be a celebration of queer love, though I could be wrong. We can certainly read it that way and celebrate the union between two women, but the 1800s were less than forgiving to anyone different. Other stories exist in a gray area. For example, the picture of Dorian Gray doesn't exactly paint a positive picture of homosexuality. That said, the author, Oscar Wilde, was gay, for which he was arrested. Positive portrayals weren't permitted, so authors like Wilde circumvented this censorship by turning queerness into something otherworldly. Many authors even made their monsters sympathetic. They still had to die, but at least you could feel for them. Though marginalized people were othered further by being relegated to literal monsters, they were still being seen, if in the only way they could be, and their humanity revealed. A modern reader can sympathize with Carmilla, because that subtext is there. Of course, it's regressive by modern standards for gay people to be solely monstrous or tragic, but such stories were a needed bridge between those times and now. And books like Dracula and Carmilla live on because people have reclaimed them. For the gay community especially, horror has been a sanctuary. It's a genre that defies convention, allowing writers, even in earlier times, to break the rules and publish taboo material in the name of scaring people. In modern times, this hasn't changed, with the trans community returning again and again to the genre. Trans writers are some of the strongest in horror-lit circles, because they understand better than anyone how it feels to be alienated or misunderstood, all feelings which are staples of the genre. Two writers of note are Andrew Joseph White and Alison Rumfitt. White has written no less than 4 horror novels, all of which have been critically acclaimed. And Alison Rumfitt published Tell Me I'm Worthless, which has also generated discussion within the horror world. There are plenty of other writers I could list, though it's worth noting that Tell Me I'm Worthless is inspired by The Haunting of Hill House, a book which had, in my opinion, gay subtext in its own right. Though horror has been wielded against vulnerable communities, marginalized groups, especially those who are gay or trans, have made the genre their own. On the filmmaking front, the likes of Jordan Peele are using horror to tell visceral Black stories and explore deeper themes. N.K. Jemisin has reclaimed the kind of horror popularized by Lovecraft, reinventing such aesthetics to tell a narrative too long overlooked. Where horror othered queer or Black individuals, it now celebrates them. This is by no means the last word on the subject, as I haven't even covered the portrayal of mental illness in the genre. Too often villains, whether in 1800 novels or even modern films like Split, people have had their monstrousness attributed to mental illness. In slashers, it would often be discovered that the titular slasher suffered some trauma, which then prompted them to kill. Sometimes people who are ill do hurt others, but more often than not, they're the victims themselves, and narratives are shifting in this respect too. In slashers, for example, it is their survivors rather than the killers who struggle with their mental health, especially in the wake of everything they've been subjected to. For marginalized groups, the horror genre, already subversive, has become a form of empowerment. Of course, beyond all the reasons I've noted, horror is just fun. More than any other genre, it's imaginative. It's not immune from falling into cliches or formulas, but more often than not, it's off the wall, strange, and convoluted in the best way. Many horror novels or books are absolute fever dreams, while books in the genres of romantasy or fantasy are maligned for being too paint by the numbers. Horror novels are given poor reviews for being too weird. Many novels, despite only having 2.5 stars on Goodreads, have cult followings. Horror novels range from the strange to the absolutely bizarre. Having read plenty of Anne Rice, I can attest to how odd the genre can get. Of all the novels I've read, Rice's have gone to places I could never have predicted. Every horror novel is able to be unique while still being true to the genre. Horror allows you to blend other genres, to break conventions, and basically write whatever the hell you want, provided you unsettle people. Horror isn't subjected to the same guardrails, which makes it, in my opinion, the most creative genre. In a horror novel, you can have a woman give birth to aliens, and somehow that will make sense to people. In horror, giant sharks eat people. Ghosts turn into babies, or babies into the devil. Portals come out of unexpected anatomical portions of the human body, and aliens coexist with God. Each horror creator is as different as the next. Stephen King, M. Night Shyamalan, and Jordan Peele tell distinct stories, yet all fit neatly under the horror umbrella. A horror film can be Friday the 13th, or it can be Ginger Snaps. A horror novel can be Firestarter, The Spirit Bears Its Teeth, or My Best Friend's Exorcism. Other genres are steeped in conventions and expectations, but horror has only one rule: scare people. Despite not reading the horror genre often, most of my favorite authors are either horror novelists or have written a horror novel. Among my favorites are Stephen King, Anne Rice, and Angela Carter. These authors are so inventive, though I want to give a shout out to Toni Morrison too. Morrison isn't necessarily known as a horror writer, but many of her books are disturbing, with Sula and The Bluest Eye coming to mind. And she wrote one acclaimed horror novel, Beloved, which is as messed up as they come. Horror allows you to push boundaries, subvert expectations, or eschew convention entirely. And because of that, horror remains refreshing when other genres hit a rut. The horror genre can stagnate on occasion, but it usually reinvents itself quicker than other genres can, and those who write horror have an originality which I find unparalleled. These are only my observations about the genre, gleaned from what I've read online or the media I've consumed. And there are countless videos and studies which go deeper than I ever could. But these are the 5 reasons I believe horror has endured, not only through the decades, but through the centuries. Be it the way it highlights our modern concerns, the catharsis it offers, its root in ancient tradition, the way it empowers marginalized voices, or the originality it offers, horror endures, and for centuries to come, it will continue to endure because it speaks to something primal and human within all of us. It's a genre I'm anxious to explore further, being a fan of the fantastical, the paranormal, and the strange. And despite how maligned the genre can be, it offers some of the best writing I've come across. Moreover, I believe there's a horror novel or film for everyone, precisely because of what horror says about us, and it's certainly a genre which speaks to me when I have the rare pleasure of enjoying it. Happy Halloween, and as always, thank you for watching, and happy reading.